Wait, if the law isn't sufficient for the day, the time, based on the crisis we now face, go to Congress and update, change, modify the law. The general counsel, who was read into this program, literally told me, if we go to them with what we want to do, they will say no. I say it that
this
way.
was ThinThread versus Trailblazer, right?
No, that's another misnomer, misconception.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I continue to this day after all these years. Trailblazer itself was supposed to be the answer, the solution for the digital age. Remember, multiple billions, right?
Mm-hmm.
It never deployed. It was it was a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. It was truly a white elephant, but because so much, basically, it was basically a single source solution is what it was. It was a consortium of primes that shared, plus subcontractors, but extraordinary amounts of money. Yeah, I mean, the original budget for Trailblazer, which greatly expanded, but the original budget was at one point totaled practically the amount that NSA was originally funded pre 9/11. That's how much money was dumped into the original award of Trailblazer. It did a whole bunch of demos, right? Dog and pony shows, right? Spent tons of money. A lot of people became millionaires. I can tell you that, right? I know first from personal, knowledge. Just stunning, because that's like, hey, as it was told to me by my supervisor, the head of the Signals Intelligence Directorate, NSA is 9/11 was a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money we want and then some. It's like, wow, wait a minute. We just failed the nation. You're not going to learn the lessons of why you failed? So there was, this decision, though, which was done in the deepest of secrecy. The actual decision, it was a piece of paper. It was not even formal, meaning David Addington, who's Cheney's, basically his
lawyer,
personal, right, kept it in his safe, okay, in the White House complex. It was so sensitive, right? It was that sensitive. So very few people were read in on the program, which was known as Stellar Wind, not Trailblazer. It was known as Stellar Wind, which in itself was, at the time, not now, but at the time, was a highly classified, this doesn't happen very often, it was a highly classified cover name for that, which was an umbrella program serving for a number of other surveillance programs and projects, some still not known or only known dimly to this day. It was the operational execution of the President Surveillance Program, which is partly where this memorandum was created, held in you talk about the closest, held extremely close to the vest by the White House. And Stellar Wind at NSA was the executive agent, right, for the PSP. So most of this program was housed, he called it the program. That's what it was known by. Anytime you mentioned Stellar Wind, it was whispered, but not whispered as the name, because that was technically, this is rare. You didn't rarely have the name itself being clouded. That's why you had a cover name, because the cover name provided cover by default. Here, it was a classified project name, program name. But the euphemism that was used for those quote unquote in the know, meaning they had been read into the program, which was not just top secret, they then put a special compartment, right, around it. I won't go into all the details. There's all kinds of the acronyms that they use, but it was far more sensitive than even SCI, sensitive compartmented information.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time. What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
Which is typically, that's where you have to go to a SCIF, right? Quote unquote, a SCIF, sensitive compartment information facility, to even look, read it, see it. It was that sensitive, super close hold. Very few people at NSA were ever read into it. So they began taking equipment. Some was provided to them because of what they're about to do. Certain NSA or certain U.S. IT corporations to set up the collection system on quote unquote U.S. networks. Now, remember, NSA could actually collect under FISA, even hot pursuit, but it would still have to go back to a court to get a warrant. Mm-hmm. This gets into a whole history of, Fourth Amendment, which is near and dear to me as part of the, first part of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, Bill of Rights. One of the reasons is I would say makes us American because it was one of the critical things on the First Amendment as well. Second Amendment, interestingly enough, right, as well as others, the right to a jury, of your peers, blah, 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 right? Speedy trial, blah, blah, blah. States' rights versus central government, because even the original Constitution, beyond the Articles of Confederation, didn't even include, because there was a huge pushback. Wait a minute. We just had a revolution, right? And one of the primary reasons we had a revolution is we want to keep our guns. We need to be able to have free speech because they were trying to censor all that. And on top of that, we have a right to our own privacy. We, secure our own.
We don't want British soldiers living
showing over the piece of papers. I can take stuff out of your house, your personal effects, and even you, right? You. Wow. That makes us America, I would argue, right? For all the faults and foibles of the Constitution, a number of things were, right? It was an experiment, no question about it. There's no question. I go on for hours about that. It is this extraordinary experiment, right? Constitutional Republic, unique form of democracy, but it was in a form of a constitutional republic. Even different from the Roman Republic, right? Yes, a republican form of government, but constitutional, giving states, and then remember, only the things that were actually delineated, right? Anything else was reserved, right? It does states and the people, right? So that's why you have those first 10 amendments, right? You have to actually go back. It took another couple of years to add those in. It wasn't built into the original Constitution. So I would argue that fundamental, but here we are, shortly after 9/11, oh my gosh, didn't matter what fights, didn't matter there's Fourth Amendment. And this was, I was told, we just need the data. You don't understand. At one point, it was told, the Constitution is quaint, out of date, can't keep up, FISA can't keep up with the times. And I'm sitting there, wait a minute. If the existing law, and it was a law, right, that was passed in 1978, which in itself was a compromise, is not keeping up with the times, even though it's been modified FISA 5 times pre 9/11. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but it's really critical that, law, just get post 9/11, law doesn't matter anymore. No law matters. And what? Only those who have power get to remain above the law? Well, that's kind of what happens, right? Mm-hmm. But no one's above the law. Well, I thought that was the case because of Nixon. I remember I was there. I was live watching the hearings. Even Hillary Rodham Clinton was originally part of the original investigation. Interesting, very young lawyer. It's and he no doubt would have been impeached, he would have been found guilty by the Senate under the provisions of the Constitution. And of course, he resigned. No person, right? No person's above the law, not even the President of the United States. Okay, well, anyways, guess that's subject to interpretation of who's in power, isn't it? Right? Mm-hmm. So what am I supposed to do, right? I mean, do I just ignore all this is going on. This isn't, we're talking in the few short weeks after 9/11. I am finding out about all this.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
That now even the United States and U.S. persons, which is defined as citizen, resident, right, could be foreign, but is here legally, right, which means they get the same protections, or U.S. under FISA, U.S. corporations, interesting enough, U.S. corporations. And it doesn't matter, stateside, territories, anywhere overseas, right? You need a warrant. Got to go to Article 3 judge to get a warrant under the provisions, the super high bar that's set by the Fourth Amendment, right? All that's tossed aside, set aside. We just need the data. We don't know where the threat is. Oh my God, right? So this is an interesting dynamic. The failure is what created the justification.
Mm-hmm.
And as Hayden would love to say, we have to move that line way over to the security side. So wait a minute. You have to actually give up liberty and rights for the sake of security? Well, Benjamin Franklin had something to say about that. It's like, that's a contradiction. Others. You can do both. We don't, but here it says, like, wait, if the law isn't sufficient for the day, the time, based on the crisis we now face, go to Congress and update, change, modify the law. The general counsel, who was read into this program, literally told me, if we go to them with what we want to do, they will say no.
Yeah.
I pause right now. Why? Because once again, I remember what it felt like when I heard that from the general counsel. The hair is standing up on the back of my neck, because it's like, we can't even go to Congress with what we're about to do. And if we ask them to change they'll say it is. That's the problem. You can't, unconstitutional lies the Fourth Amendment? What? I guess you better call a constitutional convention to get 3/4 of the states, right? Oh, okay, right, sure, yeah. Well, so you can imagine if you're a Bush Cheney, and Cheney really had the national security portfolio. He was given that, right? He was given the energy portfolio. He was given the national security portfolio. Bush just said, cause some issues later, the second administration under Bush. So here, and I did all kinds of confronting internally. This is where I could not remain silent. If I remained silent, I would be complicit in the subversion of the Constitution that I had taken an oath to support and defend. I didn't take an oath to support the president. I didn't take the oath to support violating the Constitution. I didn't take an oath to support NSA, right? I didn't take an oath to support my supervisor or the director. And I certainly didn't take an oath to cover all this up, because just shut up, Mr. Drake, and let us do, quote unquote, do what we need to do to make people feel safe again. Wow. So I started blowing the whistle internally. I was tagged, labeled as a troublemaker early on. All kinds of retaliation and reprisals started happening early on.
Mm-hmm.
I was stubborn enough to persist, even though I lost my original job. So I hung in there, right? But for several, and then I was part of multiple congressional investigations, material witness, all kinds of material documentation. Now, here's one huge difference with Snowden. I'm highly sympathetic to Snowden. We can talk about that, right? But the one thing I was not going to do was, because of non-disclosure agreements that I had signed. They're not O's, by the way. And people forget, if you look at the NDAs, I had multiple NDAs in my military and government career, including ones I signed as an NSA senior executive. You cannot use the secrecy system, right, to cover embarrassment, to cover wrongdoing, to cover violations of the law. Cannot, right? Because there's a huge temptation to do so. We know that from history, right? Even the U.S. So it wasn't, I exercised moral agency, right? It was not a dilemma per se. It wasn't like, oh my God, I'm in conflict. I would have been in huge conflict if I had chosen to ignore the oath I had taken. I would have been in violation of, true faith and allegiance to the same, right? President, by the way, has a special oath, right? Preserve, protect, and defend. So, where I only had, quote unquote, had to support and defend. It's still surreal for me to this day. All that was, of course, means president violation, vice president violation. It means certain very super high, senior officials are in violation, and of course, a very small handful of people at NSA. Now, I'm not the only one at NSA, because I mentioned one of Bill Binney, but others who were like alarmed by these developments that were happening very early on. I chose myself, right? And partly because of my, I'll say, senior status, I had an obligation, right? Not just because of the oath, but to the American people. But there were existing channels, disclosure channels for whistleblowers under existing law statute, including the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, which at the time, modified later, allowed me to go directly to the intelligence community, to the committees, right? Both in the Senate and the House. Permanent, again, formed because of all the scandals and exposures of misdeeds and violations of the law and rights of people, including civil rights, right? Over those many decades, and especially during the 60s and early 70s. So multiple agencies, by the way, not just NSA, of course, I had mentioned in more detail earlier. So those investigations go on well into the summer, right? I was not part of the 9/11 Commission. Some people thought I went to the 9/11 Commission. No, they deliberately did not. I know why, because the one thing they tried to do was shut me down, censor me from even cooperating with the committee's investigations of 9/11 at the time, right? That ensued in late 2001 and then on well into 2002. And then there was other things related to it, right? Just the fraud, waste, and abuse, the cover up for the intelligence failures surrounding 9/11, lead up plus after. And I did everything I could, in part because I was a senior executive, so I did have some sway, was to take ThinThread, which had been developed to solve all this and provide Fourth Amendment protections, including total adherence to Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And a long story short, because this was an acceleration, I became the executive lead manager for ThinThread. Bill Binney and they had left. They had retired early because they just couldn't stand by. They were much older than me, and just watch all this happen. I decided to stick around. Although they had bet I was going to leave early, I didn't. Sooner than later, but I didn't. But I wasn't allowed by my supervisor to deploy ThinThread, even though it ended up in the intelligence portion. The huge budget that's passed, right? There's actually an intelligence component. It was literally directed that NSA would deploy ThinThread in another extraordinary program called Sweep Forward. Again, these extraordinary programs that were never given an opportunity to prove themselves. NSA was directed to deploy those programs, okay, to support the national security of the United States. NSA literally subverted, they actually sabotaged that effort, but were never held to account. That's a whole nother part of the story. It's just extraordinary how far they went. Because that would have been, here's the kicker, psychologically, as an institution, it would have admitted they had quote unquote failed, right? They were wrong, that their solution didn't work, right? To keep people out of harm's way. So what happened? Well, I was able to get permission after we accelerated further development, even though it was ready to go operational well prior to 9/11, but was never given permission to do so. Got shut down in August. I was able to resurrect it, accelerated because of my background, all the time I spent in Silicon Valley, all the software engineering, all the best, we're talking rapid development, various types, right? There's various, approaches, but it was rapid iterative development, to just say it simply. We deployed
like sprints, right?
Sprints, yeah, there's different, yep. There was different way beyond the waterfall model, which just takes too long. So you build a little Tesla, build a little Tesla, build a little Tesla, and keep iterating, right? And you have extraordinarily disciplined configuration control, called CM, configuration management of all of it. You have to know what changes, right? Because every change can ripple, right? Especially with software. Something I used to, and another contract used to analyze, was actually analyze the code, look at the functions, decision trees, etc. So we accelerated the further development to do what? Couldn't go operational, but was permitted to point ThinThread against the main collection database NSA. Turned it on late February, and then it was shut down. Ran it for about 24 plus hours, and then quickly it was quickly shut down. Why? Because of what it found. Pre and post 9/11 intelligence that was not being shared, was not being analyzed. It was buried. Data corruption, probably data normalization, a whole nother dynamic, right? You're talking multiple terabytes and then some. I mean, massive amounts of data, right? And it turns out, as part of a side note, because I directed how much of the databases were corrupted. Well, upwards of 40%, which means there's all kinds of, you couldn't even extract any legitimate intelligence from it because it was corrupted, right? It was the garbage in, garbage out principle, unfortunately. And you're dealing with relational databases, right? Which is why you're basically, again, Humpty Dumpty, right? Shell, egg, the white, the yellow, the yolk, split that all out, then we're going to reassemble it. You can't reassemble it. You completely lose the original source, let alone the context, which means, guess what? You really lose is the meaning, which I thought was the whole reason we even, again, back to the traditional indications and warning, making sense, meaning. But remember what had happened, NSA sucking essentially the sea dry and then figuring out later, right, but through a huge filter. Or, as I've said, it's another way, maybe a better way to illustrate it, take the umpteen trillions of grains of sand, develop a very expensive system that removes all the sand from the beach, transport it to a landfill at the very bottom of which you have this very, very small filter, and you'll eventually figure out what's important. Well, you just lost the lay of the land, just lost what changes, you just lost where things are normal. Just watch, you'll see. The sea will cast up, right? It will. The tides, it'll throw stuff up. That's the stuff you want to know about. Or a storm comes in and exposes a wreck. I want to know about that. Or something crashes. I want to know about that. Don't even have the opportunity to do that because you removed it from its quote unquote natural setting. Even in terms of human communications, right? Even with all the vagaries and all the complexities and the nuances. So we're now going into 2003, 2004, and then I'm just going to accelerate because this becomes critical. I'm now labeled as, there's no question, I am I got pushed aside, got moved to a different organization. I was actually, ironically enough, I was in the engineering directorate, and I will grudgingly admit, I take personal responsibility for having brought in the first Google appliance, speaking of Google, to NSA. It also got turned on and then shut down. Why? They thought their red zones, which was the most protected areas of NSA, were immune to quote unquote penetration. Well, it turns out they didn't know. The little spiders just kind of cruise right through, as it turned out, a whole bunch of red zones to great embarrassment, right? Because these are the ones that are highly compartmented, right? Beyond SCI, right? Highly compartmented. Shut it down. We can't, have that. Oh my gosh. So yeah, that's a story in itself. So December 2005, I kept blowing the whistle, including the new director of NSA, Keith Alexander, who himself has gotten all kinds of hot water, went out, left after 9 years, formed a company, and just arrogance and hubris caught up with him. And that's recent, right? Last couple of years. So in December 2005, Eric Lichtblau and James Risen, New York Times investigative reporters, above the fold, as they say, with the old style, newspaper, above the fold, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, which was just the tip of the iceberg. I knew, and NSA, by the way, when the national security president went apoplectic as a result of that revelation. I knew that I would be placed, no doubt, because shortly after the revelations on the front page of the New York Times occurred, a massive multi-million-dollar national security leak investigation was stood up. I knew, because so few people knew about Stellar Wind, the president's surveillance program, even though the president tried to cover it in part by, oh, no, it's a terror surveillance program. It was never known as a terror surveillance program. It was always the president's surveillance program. But they had to cover for the fact, preclude it, and hide the fact that it was essentially an open system that had grown by leaps and bounds even since the Patriot Act days, and then some. And then there was a secret interpretation of the Patriot Act, which gave them additional access behind the scenes. Again, a whole nother part of this storyline, in terms of how far the government went off the beam when it was totally unnecessary. Never, again, I have to say this, we could have had security and still had no violations, no erosion of any rights at all, and have fully in the context of providing the common defense, could have done so, okay, for the country, right? Without having to, quote unquote, guess what? You end up eroding both, actually. You have less security and you have less liberty, which is just, it's like, wait a minute, it's kind of the worst of both worlds now. Two worlds, isn't it? So I knew I'd be placed on a short list. I had one last option. After all, I went through every single channel that existed and then some. There was one last option. And I knew this because of the Ellsberg Pentagon Papers case. Who I got to know, by the way, really, really well after everything later happened to me when I was indicted. So I ended up figuring out, and that is a story in itself, is how do you make contact with a reporter that doesn't even know you, who's probably already compromised, who's probably already being monitored, because there was yet another program at NSA that was monitoring certain media outlets, certain investigative reporters, particularly in the national security space. Little known fact, it's called First Fruits. Huge violation, right? I mean, just never mind the First Amendment implications, right? Why? In part, it's just, you can understand, I can understand in part, oh my gosh, we've gone so far off the beam when it comes to the mass surveillance, they call it bulk collection, but the mass surveillance regime, that, we've got to, not just hide this, we got to protect this from the people as long as we possibly can. So yeah, I understand, right? Why they would want to monitor, because of the fear of leaks. There was a fear on those that this program would eventually leak. In fact, Hayden actually admitted that to one of the staffers, right, for one of the intelligence community later, actually admitted that. He just wanted it to be secret for as long as possible, because obviously it was to their advantage to maintain that secrecy and just sweep up extraordinary amounts. But part of what was really sensitive about these programs is there was other sub-programs that would have created special agreements with certain companies to basically have access to all their consumer, subscriber, customer data on top of that, right? Like, whoa, now you're even going further, right? So of course he wanted to protect all this. They even kept this away from the secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is supposed to have jurisdiction in secret over all this, right? So you're even bypassing the secret oversight mechanism that would provide it. And I'm sure why you go to them. Well, I think it's because if you go to them, as much as they pretty much approve just about anything that comes in front of them, although you have to go through this affidavit process. But they didn't want to do that because they'd have to justify. They didn't want to justify. We don't want anybody in the loop. We don't want them in the loop. We don't want the judges. We don't want anybody in the loop. And those are special judges that rotate, right? Selected by the Chief Justice. So I had one last option. I could touch the third rail, go to the fourth estate, and share unclassified. This came out during my pretrial proceedings and is on the record, but share unclassified information with a reporter in the public interest because there was so much at stake. Because I knew going all the way back to just after 9/11 that this was going to have a huge blowback at some point down the road. How far? Never mind the torture regime. That never should have happened either. Remember, I know what that's like. I went through SEER training. In a training environment, went through everything they ended up turning into a torture program. Waterboarding, Chinese water drip, all the whole bunch. I went through all that, right? And we're Americans. We don't do things like this, unlike others. We're Americans. Yeah, we're Americans, right? I guess
we do things like that to our own people in SEER training, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to make, but it was to provide resistance. It was not designed to then learn how to reverse engineer it and then use it as a torture program.
Right.
Interesting enough, that program came out in public before the secret surveillance. So you can tell the secret surveillance program was even more secret than the approved torture regime. So I went to the press. I went to the press anonymously in February of 2006, contrary to what the government alleges, that because they wanted me, they thought I was the ringleader, the primary source for the New York Times article. I never had any interaction. Later I did, but not in this period at all. Had no interaction. I had just the connection. Now, was it unauthorized? Administratively, it was unauthorized. It was not a civil violation or it was an administrative policy violation, NSA, to have unauthorized contact with a reporter. I was very familiar with the system. I had published highly technical stuff in like IEEE Computer Magazine that had to go through the whole classification review process with designated classification review officers.
Mm-hmm.
So I obviously was very familiar with the process. So was I stepping outside of? Yes, I was. And was it fraught, not just because I was violating administrative policy, which meant I could be deemed untrustworthy, we no longer could keep my clearance, right? Minimum, or worse. I could end up like Ellsberg. I could end up being faced with Espionage Act charges. I knew that. I actually knew that. And I knew that by going to the press, it was inevitable that the government would catch up with me. I was already going to be, no doubt, be put on the list. It was just going to accelerate it. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, as early as April of 2006, I found out later, I was placed on a target list. A significant person of interest, as they say, TV shows, became a significant, but I was targeted. It wasn't passive. I was targeted directly. And so it turns out that they took the mole hunter unit at the FBI, which is a highly trained unit that is designed to go after real spies. Right? This is how serious they were about this leak, quote unquote leak. Mm-hmm. Leak is one mechanism a whistleblower has if they decide to either directly or not. In my case, I had gone through all the regular channels and then I did technically leak. Yes. So mole hunter unit, right? So electronic surveillance, physical surveillance. It was both overt, covert. It's quite extraordinary. My colleagues, including the primary intelligence staffer, Diane Rourke at the time, were summarily visited, I put that huge quotes, by the FBI in July of 2007. I knew because it was clear that they were considering me the primary. And there's a whole, what they attempted to do to get them on the record, even to make false statements against me, right? To set me up or frame me. I knew that they would then target me, meaning I would also be visited. Sure enough, end of November 2007, I'm getting ready at the time, because remember all the retaliation reprisals that were going on in NSA? I ended up at the National Defense University teaching strategic leadership, national security policy, and related like information technology communications. Master's program, National Defense University, into the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Side note, I led the space industries team at one point, co-led it. Actually ended up going to all the main like space industry and government sites, including going out to SpaceX at the time. This is before they had their first successful launch. That's where I met Elon. Fascinating individual, no question about that. Sat there, he regaled us with his visions of becoming a spacefaring species. Extraordinary. A couple 3 hours, right, over lunch. Fascinating, right? Just a quick side note. So that's where I was. I was getting ready to go there, and I'd gotten into electric cars early on myself. Right, this goes way back, right? This is even before the Roadster, the Tesla Roadster, had come out. So, in fact, well, I don't have the time to go into all that. So, I'm looking out the window, the bedroom, and guess what's flooding the front yard and then some? A whole bunch of FBI agents. Next 9 hours.
Where was this? What part of the country was this?
East Coast, Maryland.
Okay. All right. So in suburban Maryland.
It's where I East Coast, Maryland. So 9 hours, they just rifled the entire house. Remember, they had a warrant. It was signed by a judge, and it authorized them to search my house, search my office at the National Defense University at Fort McNair, and one of my cars, which was actually the hybrid at the time. I had a Prius. The other car was a RAV4 EV, all electric, but I usually used the Prius was my primary car. So they had a warrant to search. Plus, as I found out later, they had warrants with all the main communication where I had certain accounts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they could basically, show up with a letter. It was effectively a letter. It was, a warrant sort of gives it a meaning that I would rather not give it, right? Because essentially it's a national security letter. Turnover records. This comes out of the Patriot Act.
Mm-hmm.
I decided I didn't have to cooperate. I obviously read my Miranda rights. I had the right to have an attorney. I chose to blow the whistle again. High crimes and misdemeanors up to and including the President of the United States. Well, that's not why they even told me that. That's not why we're here, Mr. Trey. But I also allowed myself, even though it was a great risk to myself, because they could twist, turn, right? It was not recorded that I'm aware of, was not. You get into non-custodial, custodial, right? They did have another agent taking notes, what they call 302s.
Those things are pure evil, because if that agent gets something wrong, and you repeat your story verbatim, and it's wrong in that document, it is a felony, right?
Well, we'll get to that. I had four of the 10 felony counts against me in the indictment were for making false statements to the FBI.
Yeah, if they ever show up, look, this is my personal thing, and this is only in recent years because I was a Patriot, all this good stuff. If they ever show up at your door, you do not say a word. There is zero upside. Even if you're not a person of interest, under no circumstances should you ever talk to them without a lawyer. Right.
Completely agree. At that time, in that moment, I had no lawyer. Now, I chose not just to blow the whistle, but of course it wouldn't let me, but I chose, and it turned out there was 3 separate sessions. That was the first. There was another one shortly thereafter, and then another one in the spring. It was clear that I was now the target, right? But you can imagine having a team, dozen or so, show up. They were armed. It was on the front page. This is what, this is the other problem. Is like, what is the impact? Well, it's huge impact personally, and I don't have time to go into it, but it was just massive. To say I suffered, right? But that's part of the punitive nature of this, right? They want you to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
Cruelty is kind of the point.
Mm-hmm.
Being banished from your workplace is the point. Being placed on administrative leave is the point.
Yeah, they don't need to win the case. They just need to do this.
Correct.
Like all they have to do is start a case against you and bankrupt you. You could be completely innocent.
Well, they effectively did that. I was this close. I was declared indigent by the court, by the way. I spent many tens of thousands of dollars on a private attorney later. So what happened? So, I realized in April. So now we'll go accelerate to April of 2008. I'm on administrative leave. They are moving to permanently revoke my clearance. That's kind of serious. Doesn't really matter to me anymore. But I didn't want that on the record. And it clearly, and even though because I was a senior executive, I had a choice. I could select a board of my peers or appeal directly to the director of NSA because of my senior executive status. Obviously, neither prospect have a positive outcome. You can laugh about it now. So I chose to resign. Turns out in the record, I had no negative. There was no, if you look at my SF-50, the form, there is no negative comments about, there isn't. They didn't even want that. It's interesting. They could have but it
makes it look like they retaliate. It's like evidence of retaliation. Right.
Exactly. They didn't want that, right? Because that would have been evidence. See, that's the thing. You get into that whole thing, right? Exactly. You said it. So I resigned. For the next 2 years, they did everything they could, although for a while nothing happened because it's under Bush. Fall of 2008, okay, going into 2009, right? Even going into 2009. But fall of 2008, it's like my criminal defense attorney, right? He just thought the whole thing was going to be dropped because Obama's about to become president. Little did I know, they kept the case open, right? They didn't actually close it, which is a critical factor here. Obama becomes president, and it became quite clear early on that he and his DOJ were going to go after whistleblowers, right? Remember, under Bush, I was not indicted. They had a draft indictment. I have a copy of it. But that became clear, long story short, right? There was attempts to get me to plead out. I was looking at like the rest of my life. I didn't tell you at the last meeting, they brought in the prosecutor. This was Kafkaesque, closed room, no windows. So we have more than enough. We have more than enough evidence to put you away for a long, long time. How would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Drake, unless you, I'm almost directly quoting the then chief prosecutor, unless you start talking now?
No lawyer in the room?
No, there was no lawyer in the room. I said, I'm not going to plea bargain with the truth. It became sort of a famous statement in terms of my case for people that got to know it, that I was not going to plea bargain with the truth. But I knew that I was, I was in peril. There was no question I was in peril. I was looking, potentially the rest of my natural life in prison. They tried to get me to plead out. At first, it was in the range of 25 years, and then it was like 20 years, and then it was 15, 10. It was going to be a very, very long time. And plus, it was clear they wanted to set a precedent. But you have to remember, no one had actually been, in all the history, real spies, yes. But someone like myself, second whistleblower since Ellsberg. But Ellsberg himself, his case ended up being dropped, right? Because of, well, let's just say, the government overreached, right? Broke into his office looking for, dirt. So the judge in the case dropped it. He had actually gone to trial. So he never ended up in prison. Oh, he was facing, 115 years. So, here I was. They tried to get me to plead out. I said I wouldn't plea bargain with the truth. There was a final meeting involving me and my lawyer, but it was a setup. It was just before, it was April. This is now, we're talking late March, okay, of 2010. Remember, just think about the time period here. And it was essentially, it turns out this is a way, sort of their site, this is what's going to go down on you, right? They basically cut out my lawyer, meaning there was no opportunity, not even to enter into a potential plea bargain. At this point, they just wanted to drop the hammer, okay? And so what they did, they arrayed all the key people, right, to make their case. This we're talking a star chamber. That's what it was. It was a star chamber. I was declared guilty way outside the purview of the courtroom, way outside. This is a national security star chamber. So a couple of weeks later, I'm working at Apple, but I was at lunch. I get a call from my criminal defense attorney. He says, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm at lunch." He thought I was actually been taken off the street, which they could have done, taken off the street, right, and detained / confined. I wasn't. I didn't know it. So for the first time, I'm hearing now from a lawyer, oh, they just served a 10-count felony indictment on you. 5 counts for violating the Espionage Act, 4 counts for making false statements, which were in themselves false, and then 1 for obstruction of justice. Yeah. So the next 14 months, with the help of other lawyers, including whistleblower defense lawyers and attorneys, I knew I had to influence the court of public opinion. I knew that was going to happen. That in itself is a whole book, right? All that went down between the March 2010 or April 2010 timeframe all the way until June of 2011. So 14 months with my life, literally the rest of my life on the line, teetering on the edge. And I went free, which in itself is part of the story, but not before they did everything they could, right, to really influence the judge. I was fortunate to have, he's still on the bench, Judge William, he's senior status, William Bennett, the Northern District in Baltimore, the federal courthouse in Baltimore, Maryland. As much as they tried to frame me, as much as they put huge pressure on me, right, I was able to go free. No jail time, no fine, 1 year probation, 240 hours community service, which led to interviewing several dozens of veterans from World War II to the present day Iran, Afghanistan. But there were no guarantees, but it turned out some things helped. And guess what? Sort of the punchline in all this is the press. But it took a long time because the press, why would the government charge an American with the Espionage Act, right? There's no public interest defense for it. Basically, when you're charged under the Espionage Act, you're presumed guilty by virtue of being charged on the Espionage Act. It's that type of a charge. And
except you weren't leaking it to any of America's adversaries.
Did not.
Right.
No adversaries. I went to an American, as an American reporter for an American-based newspaper. And I knew this, the government would assume, and they did everything it could to say that I leaked highly classified information and that it caused the this is the phrase, exceptionally grave damage. And remember, the Espionage Act is a strict liability charge, right? Under the U.S. Criminal Code 18, U.S. 18. It's in the 7-9 series. So I'm being charged, one of the highest crimes you can charge with. It's effectively a Benedict Arnold charge, right? You betrayed your country. As an American, you betrayed your country. You deserve, short of the death penalty, right? You deserve prison for many, many years as the price you paid for doing so. Now, this is what's interesting because all I was doing, I just say it this way, is that blowing the whistle to report wrongdoing, in this case, a state crime, right, was then turned into a crime against the state. So fortunately, because then the press, it's like, wait a minute, why would they charge someone with this one? You must have done something really, really bad. I was dealing with family, and people's like, what the heck? This went public. I didn't tell you back in November 2007. It was on the local, we're talking broadcasts, right? TV channels that night, that evening, that night, and the next morning. Okay. I had a young son. He suffered all kinds of bullying. You can imagine in middle school because your dad's a spy. Yeah. So I had to deal with all kinds of, right? A lot of personal issues that, that it got worse and worse for quite a while. And of course, your entire network of people that you worked with, colleagues, people that had become friends, right? As close associates, completely blown apart. Extraordinary isolation. I didn't realize at the time, but I developed PTSD that I had to deal with, right? Because enormous pressure. I mean, it's just that in itself is a whole story. Just the extraordinary pressure when you're faced with the prospect of spending many, many decades behind bars. It does some weird things to you mentally, and just the resistance to it. I was employing my training. I haven't said this in a long time. I was using the resistance training that I went through in SEER to deal with the extraordinary abuse that the government had dropped on me, right? But I own it. Remember, I made the choice to go to the press. Mm-hmm. I still think they would have visited me. Again, it's a what if. I don't think it would have charged me with espionage, but by virtue of the fact that I did go to the press, gave them an excuse, right? And they actually thought and I knew this was a risk, that they would turn what I did provide, the reporter that was the highest, level of national security information, and they made this argument before the judge, exceptionally grave damage to the national security of the U.S. Right? In fact, they said it was worse than what a spy does, because a spy gives up secrets in secret. You gave up your secrets in public, so that's worse than a spy, because everybody gets to know the secrets, including the spies. Like, oh, well, that's one way to argue it before the judge. So there was Written Hour Truth-Telling Prize, Jane Mayer, New Yorker, Secret Share article, and then I was interviewed by Scott Pelley for 60 minutes. And then the Washington Post, of Pentagon Papers fame, wrote a couple of, this is at the board level, right? Saying, hey, government, we think he is a whistleblower. Do you remember us? Remember Watergate? Remember? How do you hold the government to account, right? Especially when they're hiding behind the veil of secrecy to do all this? Aren't you going just a little bit overboard here, right? The combination of all that. So Ellsberg was ready to fly out from California to share with anybody on the front steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Baltimore why what was going on inside the courtroom is so serious. The most serious case that had existed since his, right, at the time. Mm-hmm. The Thursday prior to the Monday, now it's June, right? Which, ironically enough, you're going back to 2011, was the 40th anniversary of the release of the Pentagon Papers, the publication, right? Go back, to that time frame. So, on the last break of the day, before they had already selected the jury and the alternates, the Monday was going to be the formal selection of the jury that would start my trial. So this is a Thursday. They weren't going to meet on Friday. It's a late afternoon break. And it turned out this is one of those things where before there was no chance at all. All of a sudden there was an off-ramp. But the off-ramp had to be on my terms with a couple of modifications, meaning drop all the charges, because what had happened, again, this isn't what happened in the week prior, is that they had they were losing, as it turns out, not just in the courtroom, but they were losing in the court of public opinion. But they wanted to then enter into quote unquote, we would like to enter into plea negotiations. Like, yeah, after all I had gone through, they want to now enter into plea negotiations with me as the defendant, criminal defendant. So there was all kinds of back and forth, and it's just fascinating when I look back on it. It was, of course, they wanted to save face, and if they could just get me to go to prison for 2 years, they would have won, right? "Quote unquote," getting prison.
Go pound sand after all that.
Pound sound. I said, nope, prepare for trial. I even told even I had pressure from my defense attorneys. Well, what's a couple of years? What's a couple of years? Because
but it ruined your life, right?
Well, not just that. I would actually be making a false plea. I'd be pleading out to something I did not do. I said, they knew that from November 2007. I had already admitted what I had done. Yeah, I violated administrative policy. I essentially exceeded my authorization, right? Here's the problem. I've been charged under the US 18, the criminal code. You have to find something in the criminal code, right, that's close enough to plead out to a misdemeanor at worst, okay, unless they just drop the entire case. But one of the risks was I could drop the entire case, but as it happened with another case similar to mine with Jeffrey Sterling, took over 2 years, right? They did what they call an interlocutory review, and they still came back, right? They could redo they could add, subtract, make things way worse. And I'd be in suspended animation, purgatory for 2 years plus. I didn't want to go that route. Do I take that risk, right? I didn't want to take the risk. But misdemeanor, yeah. Was not going to plead to a felony of any kind, but a misdemeanor, no time in jail. But here's the problem. There was no misdemeanor. Remember, strict liability law. So they had to go to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. In there was a paragraph that made reference to exceeding authorized, not unauthorized is another thing. Oh, no, you had unauthorized. No, exceeding authorized use of computer in the criminal information sheet involving no classified information. Again. And so I went free, right?
What is that Beria quote? You find me the man and I'll find you the crime.
Yes.
That's a perfect application of that, right?
Now, if any of the information I had shared with the reporter was actually classified and they played all kinds of games with what I had provided, they even altered documents, okay? They even prevented the original affidavit, which they claim was classified, which cannot be classified. They claimed the original affidavit was classified, was still under review, when in fact it had been given to the court long, and this is a whole nother side story to this. Turns out they were ordered to turn it over. They just chose to ignore the order from the court administratively. It wasn't until later I ended up going to the Southern District to pick up a copy of the original affidavit, which makes it really clear exactly how they framed me. My defense attorneys, which were the public defenders, right, never got a copy of that this whole time because the government was arguing it was under classification review. Total, just manipulation of the system. So yeah, it's turned my life inside out, upside down, which ways. I ended up, wage grade employee. I started a company, but no one I could partner with. I couldn't because I was under this cloud, right? This is before I got indicted. Mm-hmm. So I ended up at Apple as a wage grade and I worked at Apple for 13 years until my health crisis.
And what are you doing now, kind of coming out of your
retired
crisis?
I write, I travel a little bit to talk about freedom, liberty, government secrecy, surveillance, both technically. And I just came back from Berlin where I did a whole thing on artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems.
Yeah. You could do a whole
that's all. I have a lot to say about AI. Yeah. Huge can
because
of worms.
AI solves that data problem.
Yes, right? It does.
Massive amounts of data. It also, well, if you couple it with quantum computing, it also disrupts the encryption problem.
Yep.
Right, with Shor's algorithm and all that kind of stuff. So there's could be a very positive
I
future.
even predicted that. We won't go into details because highly classified, given the NSA's encryption ciphers algorithms. We detected what would happen with more advanced tools like the use of quantum. What would that mean long term? They were.
Yeah, I don't think people realize. Like,
they don't. They have
the
no
whole
idea.
banking system gone.
No, and it's pretty secure, right? The banking system
right now
is pretty secure. Yes.
Right now.
However, remember, I was very technical at one point, not anymore, right? I'm pretty familiar with all of it because still the foundational stuff is still the same. You're talking about, computers, IT, but, for me, my focus was increasingly the network and everything, inside the network and the communications systems. But obviously, how do you, that was what beautiful. I mean, I go way back. I was using PGP in the early days, but it was you had to be rather technical to even set it up properly to ensure that you actually were able to communicate. I don't even share. I still have it to this day, but I don't share the key publicly. Why? Because it's too ripe for corruption, manipulation, to make the whole social engineering thing. So. What does
PGP
I've always said,
stand for again? It's like pretty good
privacy.
Or something?
Pretty good privacy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
They considered that. Yeah. That was going to be a weapons system. There was a whole history behind where the government didn't want that out because they considered it to be a weapons system, and you can't quote unquote export a weapons system, right? But it was in the public domain. That was part of the problem. Public domain, open source, right? Which I'm very familiar with.
Any final comments for the audience?
Well, in terms of this segment, I've dedicated the rest of my life, given all of this, right? All of this. And as American who took the oath 5 times, support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, I've chosen to dedicate the rest of my life to defending life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Thank you, brother, for what you did, putting a check on unlimited power or the potential for unlimited power. It's horrifying that you had to suffer as much as you did in order to do what any American citizen should be willing to do, right, in order to protect the fundamentals of the Constitution. And in recent years, starting kind of the last 24 years or so, it's come under an assault from all sorts of different angles with social media companies, et cetera. Just watching some of these CEOs turn on a dime after cooperating assiduously with their governmental masters. I'm looking at you, Zuckerberg. And, it's good to know that there are still people out there like you that are willing to sacrifice it all, literally, in order to get the truth out. So I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you could get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site. And there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.